The nurse handed me my discharge papers on a Tuesday morning, and I signed them with a hand that still shook slightly from 11 days of antibiotics dripping into my arm. Nobody was in the waiting room. Nobody was in the parking lot. I called a cab myself, because in 11 days, not one member of my family had come to see me. My name is Vivian Marsh. I'm 36, and this is the story of the week I spent fighting sepsis alone in a hospital bed, and what my family was doing instead of sitting with me. It started with what should have been a routine surgery. I'd had gallbladder pain for months, the kind you push through because you have a job and a mortgage and no time to be sick. When it finally got bad enough that I couldn't stand upright, I went to urgent care, got sent straight to the emergency room, and was in surgery within 6 hours. The gallbladder came out clean. The infection that followed did not. By the second day after surgery, I had a fever that wouldn't break. By the third, the surgeon was using words like sepsis and closely monitored, and we need to keep her here. I spent the next 11 days hooked to IV antibiotics, watching the fever chart on the wall rise and fall in ways the nurses tried to explain to me in a calm, professional tone that didn't fully hide their concern. I called my mother, Carol, from the hospital bed the first night, still groggy from anesthesia. She was sympathetic in the way she always was, brief and vaguely maternal, the kind of sympathy that sounds right if you don't listen too closely. "That's awful, honey," she said. "Keep me posted." I texted her updates every day. "Fever still up. They're worried about my kidneys now. They think I might need another procedure if this doesn't respond." She replied to about half of them, usually some version of "hope you feel better soon" or "thinking of you." She never asked what hospital I was in. She never asked if I needed anything brought from home. My brother Dennis didn't respond to my texts at all for the first 4 days. When he finally did, on day 5, it was to ask if I still had the key to our late father's storage unit, because he needed to get into it for something unrelated to my hospitalization entirely. My sister Renata called once, on day 6, and spent most of the 7-minute conversation talking about a disagreement she was having with her landlord. She asked how I was doing exactly once, in passing, the way you'd ask a coworker about their weekend. I want to be honest about something. This wasn't new. It was simply the sharpest version of a pattern I had spent my whole adult life absorbing without naming it. I had grown up as the responsible one, the one who called to check on people, who remembered birthdays, who showed up when someone needed a ride or a place to stay or help moving. I had never once in 36 years been on the receiving end of that same effort. I had just never had a reason as undeniable as an 11-day hospital stay to notice how completely one-directional it had always been. The person who did show up, eventually, was my cousin Tasha. She drove 2 hours on day 9, sat with me for an afternoon, brought a real pillow because hospital pillows are useless, and didn't once make me feel like my being sick was an inconvenience to her schedule. She was the daughter of my mother's estranged brother, close enough to the family to know its patterns, distant enough to see them clearly. One of the night nurses, a woman named Odalis who had checked my vitals more times than I could count by that point, asked me on day 7 whether anyone was coming by that evening. I told her probably not, the same answer I'd given the 6 nights before. She didn't say anything judgmental about it, just adjusted my IV line and mentioned, almost offhand, that she'd bring me an extra blanket since the room ran cold at night. It was a small kindness, but it landed harder than it should have, because it came from someone who had no obligation to offer it at all, unlike the 4 people who did. It was Tasha, on that visit, who told me where everyone actually had been that week. "I probably shouldn't say anything," she started, which is always how people begin the sentence that changes everything. "But your mom, Dennis, Renata, and your Uncle Foster all drove out to Grandpa's place on Wednesday, together, and then from there they went to see his attorney." I sat up slightly against the pillows, the IV line pulling at my arm. "His attorney? For what?" Tasha hesitated. "From what I heard, they wanted to ask about the will, specifically about the Larkspur property, whether it had already been finalized in Grandpa's estate plan, or whether there was still time to make changes. Wednesday, day 4 of my hospitalization. The same day my fever had spiked high enough that the attending physician came in twice within a few hours. The same day I'd texted my mother that they were worried about my kidneys, and she had replied with a single line about hoping I felt better soon, before apparently getting in a car with my siblings to go ask a lawyer about real estate. I didn't say much to Tasha in that moment. I thanked her for telling me, and for the pillow, and let the fact settle into me slowly over the rest of that day, the way truths do when you're too physically depleted to have the reaction they deserve right away. My grandfather, Walter Marsh, owned a modest but valuable piece of land called Larkspur, 40 acres outside the city that had been in the family for 3 generations, with an old farmhouse on it that nobody actually lived in anymore, but that everyone had opinions about. Walter was 89, sharp most days, forgetful on others, and had spent the last several years being quietly, persistently lobbied by nearly every relative he had about what should happen to that land when he was gone. What none of them apparently knew, because I had never told them, was that Walter had made me his power of attorney and the named executor of his estate 2 years earlier, after a long conversation on his porch about how tired he was of everyone treating his land like a prize to be divided rather than a place to be cared for. He had asked me to hold that responsibility specifically because I had never once, in his words, asked him for anything. I was released from the hospital on the 11th day, weak, 10 pounds lighter, and entirely clear-headed about one thing. My family had made their priorities visible in a way words never could have. They had skipped 11 days of a hospitalization that included a genuine risk to my kidneys and possibly worse, in order to make a coordinated trip to question a lawyer about land that wasn't even theirs to ask about yet. I didn't call anyone for the first few days home. I focused on recovering, on eating real food again, on walking to the end of my block and back without needing to sit down halfway. When I finally felt steady enough, I drove out to see my grandfather myself. He was on the porch, the way he almost always was, and he looked at me for a long moment before he said anything. "You look thin," he said, "and tired around the eyes." "I had surgery," I told him, "then an infection. I was in the hospital for 11 days. His face changed, a slow shift from mild concern into something sharper. "Nobody told me that. I'm not surprised," I said. "They were busy that week." I told him plainly, without embellishment, what Tasha had told me, that his children and grandson had driven out together the same week I was fighting sepsis, specifically to ask his attorney about the Larkspur property. I watched something settle in his expression, not quite surprise, more like confirmation of something he had already suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. "They came out here that Wednesday," he said slowly, "told me they were just checking in." Foster kept steering the conversation toward the farmhouse, asking if I'd thought more about subdividing it. I told them I hadn't decided anything new. "They went from here straight to your attorney's office," I said. "The same day." He was quiet for a while, looking out at the fields he'd spent most of his life tending. "I raised 4 children who learned to circle land like it was the only thing worth showing up for," he said eventually, "and 1 granddaughter who showed up for me instead." 2 weeks later, my grandfather asked me to accompany him to his attorney's office, a meeting he scheduled himself, at his own request, without telling anyone else in the family in advance. His attorney, a careful, precise man named Mr. Abernathy, reviewed the existing estate plan with both of us present. Walter made one change that day. He formalized, in writing, that the Larkspur property would pass directly into a conservation trust upon his death, administered by me, with instructions that it never be subdivided, sold, or converted into anything other than what it had always been. No relative, he specified by name, would have any claim to alter those terms. "I'm not doing this to punish anyone," he told Mr. Abernathy, though I suspected he was doing exactly that, at least in part. I'm doing it because my granddaughter spent 11 days fighting an infection nobody in this family bothered to check on, while the rest of them were busy asking you about my land. That tells me everything I need to know about who actually deserves a say in what happens to it. Word got back to my mother within the week, the way things always did in our family, faster than anyone intended. She called me, her voice tight in a way I recognized from childhood, the tone she used when she felt she was owed an explanation. Your grandfather says he's changing the trust because of something you told him, she said, about the hospital. I told him the truth, I said, that I was septic for over a week, and that none of you visited, and that instead you drove out to ask his lawyer about the farmhouse. We were worried about the property being left in limbo, she said, an explanation that answered nothing. I was worried about my kidneys, I said. I would have liked one visit, just one, in 11 days. She didn't have an answer for that. Dennis called a few days later, defensive in a way that told me Tasha's information had been entirely correct. Renata sent one long text accusing me of turning Grandpa against the family, which I read once and didn't respond to, the way I'd learned to handle messages that weren't actually asking for anything except my silence to end. My Uncle Foster was the last to reach out, calling nearly a month after the others, his tone carefully casual in a way that told me he'd rehearsed it. I heard about the trust, he said. I just want you to know I never meant for it to look the way it looked. We were trying to get ahead of things before Dad's memory got worse, that's all. You were trying to get ahead of things the same week I was in the hospital, I said. You could have called me instead. You had my number. You've had it for years. He didn't have much of an answer for that either, just a long pause and a comment about how he hoped we could put it behind us eventually. I told him I wasn't interested in pretending it hadn't happened, but that I also wasn't interested in carrying a grudge around for the rest of my life. Some things simply changed permanently once you saw them clearly, and I'd rather live with that clarity than pretend I hadn't noticed it at all. My grandfather passed 8 months later, peacefully, in his sleep, in the same farmhouse he'd spent his whole life protecting. The conservation trust took effect exactly as written. My mother and my siblings contested it briefly, meeting with their own attorney to explore options, and were told within a week that Walter's documentation was airtight, drafted, and revised with full mental competency on record, with a clear, well-documented rationale attached to the final change. I still visit Larkspur every few weeks. I walk the fields the way my grandfather used to, checking the fence lines, making sure the old farmhouse roof is holding up against another winter. It will never be subdivided, never be sold to developers, never become the thing my family spent years quietly angling for while I was busy being the one who showed up for everyone and nobody showed up for me in return. I think about that hospital room sometimes, the fever chart on the wall, the 11 days I spent mostly alone except for a cousin who drove 2 hours because it was the right thing to do, and a night nurse who brought me a blanket without being asked. I don't think about it with anger anymore, not really. I think about it as the moment I finally understood what my family valued, and the moment my grandfather decided, quietly and without asking anyone's permission, to make sure the thing he cared about most would end up in the hands of someone who had never once shown up for the wrong reasons. Tasha and I are closer now than we ever were growing up, which feels like its own quiet answer to everything that happened that year. She visits Larkspur with me sometimes, and we walk the same fence lines my grandfather used to check. Not because anyone is required to, but because it feels like the kind of thing worth doing without being asked. I've learned there's a real difference between people who show up because they want something from you, and people who show up simply because you matter to them. It took an 11-day hospital stay for me to finally be able to tell the two apart, but I don't think I'll ever have trouble telling them apart again.